Would you please pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. When I was in seminary, I took a class on preaching in the African American style of preaching. And I remember at one point the professor telling us that every good African American style sermon begins with the preacher giving the name of his sermon, or her sermon, to the congregation as like the beginning point. I've never done that before, but this one has such a title that I thought it might be fun to do that. The title of the sermon for tonight is Naked. Just had to say it. So I was recently talking with another young family about, taking your kids to the doctors, like your little kids to the doctors. They have kids about my kids' age. And we talked about the struggle of things like getting shots with kids. I mean, maybe if your kids are amazing at getting shots, God bless you. It's not been our experience. We talked about the nervousness of like going to the doctor and being worried that they're going to tell you they found something on your child that is like life-changing or life-altering for your family. We talked about just the sort of goofiness of taking your kids to the doctor in general. One of the crazy things that this other parent shared with me about when they take their kids to the doctor is how hard it is to for their one child to take their clothes off for the exam. Like they have a younger child, and for them, they just love to take their clothes off and get naked and run around the exam room. The older one, though, is horrified and makes a big deal about it every time they go. In the end, it gets so bad for the older one that he refuses to take off his clothes, and so the doctor works around fully clothed older child because he will not remove his shirt even for the doctor. So I can see this reality. Our littlest one in our household also has no problem running around his house or living in a clothing optional world, perhaps we'll say. He has this beautiful confidence in his nakedness. He even makes a big joke out of it regularly, much to the chagrin of everyone else being uncomfortable. In particular, his older brother is not comfortable with this at all. Jacob doesn't like to take his shirt off in front of people at all. He will only change his clothes in his room. And I seem like I'm picking on him, but I'm not, because you know why? I'm just like him. I'm that way too. It's probably why I don't like to go to the beach. That place where you're expected to be wearing like very little clothing. I'd much rather go for a hike in the mountains than sit on the beach shirtless. Walking down the beach for a stroll, that thing everybody loves to do, is like torture for me. It makes me uncomfortable just to think about it. If I'm honest with myself, I'm a very self-conscious person. I do not have a very favorable self-image of my body. And that is actually frighteningly common in our culture. That is to say, I doubt I'm the only one that experiences that in this room. And indeed, the statistics indicate that there are a vast majority of us that exist in that same reality. There is a large percentage of people, men and women, who are unhappy about their body image. And those numbers for women are downright stomach-churning. Women, in overwhelming percentages, have poor self-image perceptions. One of my favorite people in all the world, I've read a couple of her books and just think she's brilliant, Brene Brown, researcher. She has concluded in her studies that body image is the number one trigger for shame in women. All the terrible struggles that women deal with in our world, in our society, the image of themselves is the most destructive. In so many ways, we hate ourselves. We hate our bodies. We hate that which is so uniquely and particularly us. And isn't this truer as we age for many of us? As more of that gray and white hair shows up on our bodies? As we don't metabolize pizza and ice cream like we used to? As our bodies shrink, well, at least in terms of height, they do expand in other places. As our skin sags and wrinkles define our aged faces. I have to think I am similar to others in the few moments when I've looked into the mirror and been shocked at the aging person that gazed back at me. And yet, the celebration of this night is that God shows up into the world and intentionally takes on those realities. If you think about it, God deciding to come here and be human like us is pretty shocking. Sadly, we as Christians, we often talk about Jesus, and all we want to talk about is Jesus was born, and then Jesus died and was resurrected. And that's like the entirety of the Jesus story. Born, died, resurrected. That's an especially sad direction to take of the story of Jesus on this day, on his birthday. Can you imagine if like every time we had a baby in our life, we'd be like, yep, but someday they'll die. It would be awesome, wouldn't it? Look at my little baby. You know it's going to die someday. What? We tell this story of God coming to earth to be with us. And then we connect it to and Jesus will die. When we do that, we miss out on perhaps the more moving and shocking reality of this day. We miss out on the beauty of who God is. God, indeed, did not show up into the world to die. God showed up to live. God showed up to love. And God showed up to declare that love is a better way for everyone else to live. Do you know how God shows up in the world? Here it comes. God shows up in the world naked. Right? Literally naked. That's God's grand entrance into the world. So I've been at these birth things now 3 times in my life. I know, I'm not an expert on them, but I think I know how the whole birthing thing works. Babies show up naked. They do. They aren't wearing any special robes with a beautiful blue sash over them. Babies don't come out of the womb wearing loincloths or diapers. Contrary to the little baby we often show around the church here, babies do not come out of the womb wearing a onesie. They are covered sometimes in blood and other fluids, but never with clothing. Babies come out naked. In fact, in the birthing process, it has been my experience, there's a lot of nakedness. Lots of very culturally private stuff in the moment of birth becomes very public. That which we often desire to hide in childbirth becomes exposed. And again, that's how God shows up into the world. Naked, exposed, bearing it all. An unpretentious and bloody human body. And it was a body that would age. Jesus would eat and fart. Jesus would pee and poop. Jesus would burp and vomit. Because those are the things we humans do. And if God seriously comes to be with us and be like us, those are the things God does too. God went through puberty and got hair in places that were new. His voice probably cracked, and the other kids probably teased him. He probably got tired and cranky. His hair might have turned gray, and he bled and bruised. One of my favorite traits of Jesus is that he gets mad. And my 5-year-old daughter likes to remind me of this regularly when I'm telling the kids not to be angry with each other. She'll say, "But Daddy, God got mad. Remember that time when he went into the church and flipped over the tables?" Score one for the children. But Jesus doesn't just come into the world owning his naked body. He lives a life of nakedness. Maybe not physically naked all the time, but he's emotionally naked. He's a spiritually naked, relationally naked. You see, all those stories we want to bypass and just get to birth, death, resurrection. They're stories of Jesus doing stuff and being real and being exposed to people. They're not all stories of rainbows and unicorns and puppy dogs. I mean, granted, there are healings and miracles and people being brought back to life, but there's also anger, plotting, killing, ethnic and racial hatred, sexual immorality, death, sadness, weeping, fear, people struggling with hope. But those things aren't permanent. It's exactly in those places where God comes in, where Jesus shows up and is exposed, on full display, naked, if you will. Jesus bears himself by suggesting that people react in difficult moments in radically new ways, culturally dissident ways, like forgiving people, praying for your enemies and those who persecute you, reconciling with those who do you wrong, especially family people, radical hospitality to the poor, people imprisoned, or just people at risk. Jesus rolls up his sleeves and digs into the hard moments. You know what he doesn't do? He doesn't just fix them. He doesn't fix everybody's issues. Again, there are healings, there are moments when people are made healthy, but he doesn't always fix things. Death still happens. But what he does do is he invites people to look at the struggles in new ways. Rather than being mad at someone who's hurt you, seek reconciliation. Rather than hating those who have done wrong to you and deserve everything evil, perhaps, consider their hurt or the broken place they come from, and then pray for them. Perhaps most shocking, Jesus does this in the midst of community. As people continue to hurt him and burn his bridges, he just calls them in even closer and seeks to be nearer to them. It seems to me you cannot know God or the fullness of what God is up to in the world without the benefit of community, in all of its beauty and in all of its dysfunction. This is the night that we remember God showed up with us. God leaves the up there, the out there, or the somewhere else and comes here, now. And if you wonder what God looks like, take a longer look in the mirror next time you look there. That's what God looks like. If you wonder what God looks like, look deep into the eyes of anyone and everyone you encounter in your world, because truly there God is. If you wonder what it looks like when God shows up, perhaps we ought to be exposed. Perhaps we ought to dare to be naked and vulnerable with those around us. Amen.